Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Cotton.
Democrats in the committee and Judge Jackson herself have repeatedly said that senators should look to her record to see what kind of justice she would be. Although some of our Democratic colleagues now claim that it's engaging in conspiracy theories to dare to ask Judge Jackson about that very record. Her record and her answers are clear. Judge Jackson may be a fine woman, but she has built her career as a far-left activist, and that didn't change when she put on a black robe 10 years ago. In fact, Judge Jackson remains more of a defense attorney for criminals from the bench than a judge. Across the board, Judge Jackson's average sentences for criminals are 34% lighter than the national average for criminal cases, and 25% lighter than the average on her own old court, the D.C. District Court. And the child pornography cases are just the most sensational examples of her soft-on-crime attitude. In her hearing, she talked about how deeply disturbing these cases are and how she always gave the criminals a really serious talking to for their possession and distribution of videos of young children being sexually abused. But a serious lecture is not a serious sentence. These aren't just numbers, these are criminals with real victims. And they go on to victimize again because Judge Jackson lets them off early. One of those criminals was Wesley Hawkins, who was a serious child pornography offender that Judge Jackson let off easy. The sentencing guidelines recommended 8 to 10 years in prison, 8 to 10 years. Judge Jackson gave him just 3 months. And that's only 1/6 of what her own probation office recommended. And a few years later, when Hawkins would still have been in prison if she had followed the guidelines, he did something else that got him 6 more months in custody, twice the original sentence. When all 11 Republicans on this committee sent a letter asking for details of what happened, Judge Jackson refused to provide any further information. I guess so much for looking at her record. Of course, her leniency isn't limited to these child pornography cases. In 2017, Judge Jackson apologized. She apologized to a fentanyl kingpin with a history of drug trafficking because she couldn't find a way to give him less than the mandatory minimum sentence imposed by Congress. And she felt bad about being so mean to a fentanyl kingpin. A couple years later, though, she found a way to twist the law to resentence him below the mandatory minimum sentence by making the First Step Act retroactive, even though Congress had explicitly chosen not to make it retroactive. She also said that there were no victims in the case. Fentanyl trafficking is not a victimless crime, and anyone who doesn't understand that does not belong on the Supreme Court. Judge Jackson also granted compassionate release to a man who brutally murdered a deputy U.S. Marshal by shooting him on the steps of a church at a funeral. He was repeatedly denied parole, and in prison he had racked up infractions for things like threatening prison staff and possessing a dangerous weapon. Not exactly a reformed saint. Judge Jackson granted him compassionate release anyway because he had high blood pressure. In 2013, a sex offender had repeatedly raped his 13-year-old niece and was arrested for falsifying sex offender records to avoid telling the government where he was living, or that he was working at a daycare despite a restriction on his contact with children. The government asked for him to go to prison for 2 years. Judge Jackson gave him just 1 year. During that second year, when he should have been in prison, yes, he went on to try to rape again and then bribe the victim with $2,500 to recant her testimony. Judge Jackson habitually sympathizes with criminals over victims. These are just a few of the many cases in Judge Jackson's record that all make one thing clear. If you are a criminal, you would be lucky if your case is assigned to Judge Jackson. If you are the victim of a crime or anyone else seeking justice, you better hope your case got assigned somewhere else. As a trial judge, Judge Jackson could only give the benefit of the doubt to one criminal at a time. As a Supreme Court justice, she would be able to give the benefit to criminals nationwide in all cases. Let's consider her terrorism cases. She seems to have a real interest in helping terrorists. Now, it's true that you shouldn't judge a lawyer solely for taking on an unpopular case, and defending criminals doesn't necessarily make someone ineligible to be a judge. But during the Bush administration, representing terrorists was all the rage in liberal legal circles. These were not unpopular cases, but instead, lawyers at liberal law firms and public defender's office fought with each other to be able to work for these terrorists. Judge Jackson represented 4 terrorists as a public defender, one of whom she continued to represent in private practice. She also argued in favor of terrorists in 2 other cases in amicus briefs while in private practice. Her backers try to have it both ways. On the one hand, they say this is all just assigned work, but on the other hand, they celebrate her as a hero for volunteering for so-called assigned work. Well, whether it was assigned or volunteered, the fact that Judge Jackson didn't do a very good job. In 3 of the 4 cases, her filings were identical, word for word, comma for comma. She alleged identical facts and legal arguments in every one of those cases. The only differences was the swapped out name and case numbers. So let's look at those terrorists. One of her terrorist clients designed the prototype shoe bomb that was used in an unsuccessful attempt to blow up a passenger airplane. Another of her terrorist clients planned and executed a rocket attack on U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and another of her terrorist clients was arrested in a raid on an al-Qaeda explosive training camp. Yet in every case, she claimed that her clients had nothing to do with terrorism and had never been affiliated with al-Qaeda or the Taliban, despite having no reason to believe that her alleged facts, copied and pasted from one brief to the next, were true. Judge Jackson also has a habit of refusing to answer simple common sense questions in her hearing and in questions for the record. Famously, when Senator Blackburn asked her what a woman was, she claimed that she had no idea. I asked her who has more of a right to be in the United States, new American citizens who follow the rules, waited their turn and came the right way, or illegal aliens whose very first act in the United States was to break our laws and who continue breaking them every day that they remain here illegally. Judge Jackson declined to answer. And when I asked Judge Jackson whether releasing Guantanamo Bay terrorists would make us more safe or less safe, she again pretended to have no clue. And of course, she refused to take an opinion on court packing, unlike the justice she would replace, Stephen Breyer, or the sainted Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Judge Jackson plays ignorant not because she doesn't know these answers, but because her liberal judicial philosophy is based on denying reality and trying to invent a new reality through the brute force of will as a judge. Judge Jackson's attempts to invent a new reality demonstrate a willingness to skirt the law when it doesn't fit her preferred outcome. Not only did she engage in what the Sixth Circuit called an end run around Congress to make the First Step Act retroactively reduce the sentence of that fentanyl kingpin I mentioned earlier, she also worked hard to strike down a Trump administration policy of removing recently arrived illegal aliens. The law passed by Congress granted DHS, quote, sole and unreviewable discretion on the issue. But Judge Jackson inserted herself to strike down what she called, quote, a terrible proposal by DHS, as if it's the judge's place to decide what is and is not a terrible immigration proposal. The D.C. Circuit Court, no hotbed of conservative activism, reversed her and noted that, quote, there could hardly be a more definitive expression of congressional intent than the clear language of the statute she disregarded, because she didn't care. She had an anti-Trump op-ed to write in the form of a judicial opinion as part of her audition for the political left to put her on the Supreme Court one day. Last week, Senator Durbin said that despite Judge Jackson saying explicitly that she doesn't have a judicial philosophy, she does have one, but, quote, you have to take the time to read any or all of her 578 opinions that she has issued. And for once, Senator Durbin and I see things similarly. Judge Jackson has a judicial philosophy, and that philosophy is obvious from her record on the bench. Judge Jackson will coddle criminals and terrorists. She will twist and ignore the law to reach any result that she wants. That is not what we need from a Supreme Court justice, and that is why I will vote no on her nomination.